Many dog owners have experienced the same moment. Everything seems normal. Your dog is walking beside you, the leash is loose, the pace feels comfortable, and then, without much warning, he stops completely. For a second, it almost feels as if someone pressed a pause button. You take another step. Your dog stays where he is. You give a gentle encouragement, maybe a quiet, come on. Nothing. Sometimes the dog is not looking at you at all. He may be staring ahead or standing still with his nose slightly lifted, just watching. And this is usually the moment when people start searching for an explanation. Maybe he's being stubborn. Maybe he doesn't want to listen. Maybe he's decided the walk is going to happen on his terms. It's an understandable conclusion. After all, from the human perspective, the dog simply stopped moving. But what many people notice first is only the final part of the behavior, the stop itself. What often goes unnoticed is everything that may have happened just before it: a smell, a sound, a change in the environment, a moment of hesitation that lasted only a second or two. And in many cases, that changes the entire meaning of what we're seeing. Because a dog that suddenly stops is not always refusing to continue the walk. Sometimes he may be responding to something that feels important from his perspective, even if we never notice it ourselves. And that is where this behavior starts becoming much more interesting. When a dog suddenly stops during a walk, most people naturally look for an explanation. And the explanation often sounds something like this: he just doesn't want to go. He's being stubborn. He's trying to decide where we're going. Sometimes that interpretation feels convincing, especially when the dog seems perfectly healthy and simply refuses to take another step. But there is another possibility that is easy to overlook. Dogs do not necessarily experience walks the way we do. For us, a walk often has a destination, a direction, a pace. We think about moving forward. Dogs may be paying attention to something very different. What many dogs seem to care about most is not how far they travel. It's what they discover along the way: the smells, the sounds, small changes in the environment, bits of information that barely register to us at all. And that difference matters more than it may seem. Because if a dog views a walk as an opportunity to gather information, then stopping can take on a completely different meaning. The pause may not be opposition, it may not even be hesitation. In some situations, it may simply be part of how the dog experiences the walk itself. And once you start looking at it that way, the stop begins to make a little more sense. Before we continue, it helps to look at one of the most common reasons dogs stop in the first place: a smell. Not necessarily a strong smell, and not necessarily one we can detect ourselves. You may see your dog stop near a patch of grass, a mailbox, or the edge of a sidewalk and wonder what could possibly be so interesting. From our perspective, there may be nothing there at all. But a dog's experience can be very different. What appears to be a simple sniff may contain a surprising amount of information. Information about other dogs, information about recent activity, information about changes in the environment that happened long before you arrived. In many cases, dogs are not just detecting scents, they are gathering details from them. Who may have passed through the area, whether the scent is familiar or unfamiliar, whether something has changed since the last walk. And that process does not always happen instantly. Sometimes you'll notice your dog standing completely still, nose working, body quiet, almost as if he's concentrating. What many owners interpret as wasting time may actually be a period of information gathering. And the more interesting the scent appears to be from the dog's perspective, the longer that pause may last. Which means that a stop on a walk is not always about where the dog wants to go next. Sometimes it may be about understanding what has already happened there before he arrived. Of course, not every stop is caused by a smell. Sometimes the environment itself changes the walk. You may notice your dog moving normally one moment and then slowing down or stopping as something appears ahead. A delivery truck, a group of people, construction equipment, a bicycle moving unexpectedly, or even an object that was not there during yesterday's walk. What makes this interesting is that the stop often happens before the dog does anything else, before barking, before turning away, before pulling back. There is simply a pause. The dog stands still and looks. Sometimes the ears move forward, sometimes the body becomes a little more rigid. Sometimes the dog just watches quietly for a few seconds. And those few seconds may be more important than they appear, because dogs are constantly processing information from their surroundings. When several things happen at once, some dogs seem to slow down and evaluate the situation before deciding what to do next. A busy street, new sounds, unfamiliar movement, a lot of activity in a short period of time. For some dogs, that can create a moment of hesitation. From the owner's perspective, it may look as though the dog is refusing to walk, but the dog may not be refusing anything at all. He may simply be taking a little time to understand what is happening around him. And that becomes even easier to notice when something on the walk changes unexpectedly. Another detail that owners sometimes overlook is how familiar many walks become, not just to us, to dogs as well. If you walk a similar route most days, your dog may begin to recognize certain patterns long before you realize it. The usual turn at the corner, the path through the park, the direction you normally take after crossing the street, not necessarily as a precise map, but as a sequence of familiar events. And because of that, small changes can stand out. You decide to go a different way. A sidewalk is closed. A large decoration suddenly appears near a house you've passed 100 times before. Or maybe a section of the route simply looks different than it did yesterday. Some dogs barely react. They notice the change and keep moving. Others pause. You may see them stop and look for a moment. Perhaps they glance ahead. Perhaps they sniff the area more carefully than usual. It can be a very quiet behavior, and that is one reason it is often misunderstood. From the human perspective, the dog seems unwilling to continue, but the pause may have very little to do with refusing the walk. In many cases, the dog may simply be comparing what he expected to find with what is actually there, trying to make sense of a change before moving on. And sometimes that brief moment of caution becomes much harder when tension enters the leash. This is often where a small pause turns into something much bigger. The dog stops. At first, it's only a moment, a few seconds of standing still, looking, listening, or paying attention to something we may not even notice. Then the leash becomes tight. The owner encourages the dog to move. Nothing happens. So the pressure increases a little and then a little more. It's a completely understandable reaction. Most people assume the goal is simply to get the walk moving again, but sometimes something unexpected happens. The dog may no longer be focused only on the smell, the sound, or the change in the environment. Now, there's another factor in the situation: the leash itself. For many dogs, leash pressure is information too. It changes the experience. It adds tension to a moment that may have started as simple curiosity or uncertainty. You may even notice that the harder someone tries to end the pause, the longer the pause seems to last. Not because the dog is trying to win a battle, and not because the dog is being difficult, but because the interaction between dog and owner has become part of the moment. In some cases, the owner may think they are solving the stop, when in reality, they may be accidentally making the stop more important than it was to begin with. And understanding that can completely change the way we respond when a dog pauses during a walk, especially as dogs begin to move through the world differently with age. That last point becomes especially interesting with older dogs. Many owners notice that the pauses seem to increase with age, not necessarily every day, and not necessarily in a dramatic way. The dog simply begins moving through the walk a little differently. You may notice longer stops at familiar places, more time spent sniffing, more time looking around before continuing. Sometimes there may be physical reasons for this, but physical comfort is only one piece of the picture. In many cases, older dogs also seem less interested in rushing through the environment. The walk becomes less about covering distance and more about experiencing what is around them. A smell that once received a quick sniff may now hold their attention for much longer. A change in the environment may be evaluated more carefully. A familiar route may be explored at a slower pace. And when we expect the same speed and rhythm we saw years earlier, those pauses can be easy to misunderstand. What looks like reluctance may sometimes be caution or curiosity, or simply a dog taking a little more time to process the world around him. And once you start looking at those pauses that way, they often become much easier to understand. Which brings us to a simple question you can ask yourself on your very next walk. The next time your dog suddenly stops during a walk, try something simple. Before encouraging him to move, Take a moment to observe, just for a few seconds. Many of the clues appear right before the stop happens, not after. You might notice your dog's head turn toward a sound. You might see his nose lift into the air. Perhaps his attention shifts toward something across the street. Or maybe there is a new object ahead that wasn't there yesterday. Sometimes the leash became tight a moment earlier. Sometimes the dog had been slowing down long before he actually stopped. These details are easy to miss because most of us focus on the pause itself. The stop feels like the important event, but very often the stop is only the result of something that happened a few seconds before. And once you start looking for those small details, patterns begin to appear. You may notice that your dog stops in noisy places, or near certain smells, or whenever the usual route changes unexpectedly. The goal is not to analyze every step of every walk. It's simply to become a little more curious about what your dog may be responding to. Because the more attention you give to what happens before the stop, the easier it becomes to understand the stop itself. And that understanding can change the entire way you think about these moments. By this point, the stop may look a little different than it did at the beginning of the video. At first, it can seem like a simple refusal. The dog stops, the walk stops, and it feels as though the dog has made a decision not to continue. But when you look a little closer, many of these moments are not nearly that simple. Sometimes the dog has found a scent worth investigating. Sometimes the environment feels unusually busy. Sometimes something on the route has changed. Sometimes age has simply slowed the pace of how the dog moves through the world. And from the outside, all of those situations can look remarkably similar. The same pause, the same stillness, the same dog standing quietly at the end of the leash. What changes is the reason behind it. That is why understanding the pause is often more useful than trying to end it as quickly as possible. Not every stop needs a solution. Sometimes it needs a moment of observation. A moment to ask what your dog may be noticing that you are not. Because walks are not only about movement. For many dogs, they are also about gathering information, evaluating the environment, and making sense of the world around them. And the next time your dog suddenly stops, you may find yourself seeing something different. Not a stubborn dog, but a dog paying attention to something that matters from his perspective.